You've been told we're going back to the moon for exploration. But if that were the real reason, this wouldn't be happening now, and it wouldn't look like this. For decades, the moon has been treated as a completed chapter. We went, we explored, we left. The story felt closed, almost settled, as if everything that mattered had already been discovered. So when the idea of returning began to surface again, it was presented in a way that felt familiar. A continuation. A new generation finishing what the last one started. A natural step forward. But when you begin to look closely at how this return is unfolding, something doesn't fully align with that narrative. The urgency feels different. The scale feels different. The decisions being made don't resemble a simple revisit, but something far more deliberate. Missions are no longer isolated events. They are part of a sequence, carefully structured, building towards something that is not immediately explained. And this is where the question begins to shift. Not whether we are going back, but why now after so much time when the moon has been there all along? Because if the goal were only exploration, there would be no reason for this level of coordination, this level of investment, or this sudden global attention. Something changed. And whatever that change is, it's not being understood at the surface level. To understand what is happening now, you have to return to the moment that shaped everything. The Apollo missions were not just technological achievements, they were symbols of capability, proof that reaching the moon was possible with the tools and knowledge of that time. When humans first stepped onto its surface, it created the impression that the challenge had been solved, that the moon was no longer out of reach. And for a while, that belief held. The missions ended, the urgency faded, and attention shifted back to Earth. The moon remained where it had always been, but interest in it quietly disappeared. It became part of history, something we had already done, rather than something we still needed to understand. The narrative settled into a simple idea. We went, we learned what we needed, and there was nothing left that justified going back. That assumption shaped decades of thinking. If the moon had already been explored, then returning would only repeat what was already known. It would offer little that could not be achieved through other means, at lower cost and with less risk. And so the absence of missions began to feel logical, almost inevitable. But that is where the tension begins to form. Because if the moon truly had nothing left to offer, if it had already given us everything it could, then this return would make no sense. Not at this scale, not with this level of coordination, and not with this renewed sense of urgency, which leads to a more uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the moon was never as understood as we believed, or maybe what mattered about it was not what we were looking for back then. If nothing about the moon has changed, then the reason for going back must have, and that is where the first inconsistency begins to appear. For decades, the moon remained untouched, not because it was unreachable, but because it was considered unnecessary. The technology existed, the knowledge was there, and yet the missions stopped. Not gradually, but completely. Now, after all that time, the return is not only happening, it is accelerating. Timelines are tightening, budgets are expanding. Missions are no longer spaced years apart, but designed as a continuous sequence. And what stands out is not just the decision to return, but the speed at which everything is moving forward. That shift raises a question that is rarely asked directly. What changed between then and now that justifies this level of urgency? Because if the moon itself is the same, then the difference must exist somewhere else. In priorities, in technology, or in the way the moon is being understood today. And when you compare the past with the present, the contrast becomes difficult to ignore. The Apollo missions were driven by a clear objective that ended once it was achieved. What is happening now does not feel like an objective with an endpoint. It feels like the beginning of something designed to continue. So the question is no longer about returning. It is about what made returning necessary. The moment you step outside the NASA narrative, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. This is no longer a single program moving in isolation. Multiple nations are aligning their timelines around the same objective, investing in technologies that point in the same direction, and accelerating their presence beyond Earth at the same time. The moon is no longer being approached as a distant goal. It is being approached as a shared focal point. China is advancing its own lunar roadmap with increasing precision. Private companies are developing systems not just to reach the moon, but to operate there repeatedly. Even partnerships that once seemed unlikely are beginning to form around access, transport, and infrastructure. What used to be exploration is starting to resemble positioning. And this is where the meaning of the moon begins to shift. It is no longer just a place to visit. It becomes a location that can be occupied, used, and eventually depended on. A point of presence rather than a destination. And once that shift happens, the logic behind the urgency starts to make more sense. Because when multiple actors begin moving toward the same place at the same time, it is rarely about curiosity. It is about what that place allows you to control, access, or influence once you are there. When you look closer at where these missions are actually going, the pattern becomes even more precise. The focus is no longer on the regions that were explored before. It is shifting toward specific areas that, until recently, were largely ignored. The lunar South Pole has become the center of attention, and not by coincidence. Unlike the equatorial zones visited during Apollo, the South Pole contains regions that never receive sunlight, permanent shadows, untouched for billions of years, where temperatures remain so low that certain materials can exist in a stable form. Among them, water ice, not in vast oceans, but in deposits that are difficult to access, yet incredibly valuable. Water, in this context, is no longer just a resource for survival. It can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen, transformed into fuel, and used to sustain long-term operations beyond Earth. Suddenly, the moon is not just a destination, it becomes a supply point. And this is where another detail begins to stand out. The missions are not designed for short visits. They are testing systems that can endure, adapt, and operate repeatedly in these exact conditions. Landing precision, energy management, habitat concepts. Each piece fits into a larger structure that is not being described as a whole. These are not isolated experiments. They are fragments of a system being assembled, one step at a time. At this point, the idea of exploration begins to feel incomplete, not incorrect, but insufficient to explain the scale and direction of what is being built. Because exploration ends once the unknown becomes known. What is happening now does not move toward an endpoint. It moves toward continuity. When you place the pieces together, the shift becomes clearer. The focus is not just on reaching the moon, but on remaining there. Establishing presence, maintaining access, and creating systems that reduce dependence on Earth over time. This is no longer about a mission, it is about a foothold. And that shift does not require speculation. It follows a simple line of reasoning. If a location offers resources, strategic position, and long-term utility, then returning to it is not optional. It becomes necessary, not immediately, but inevitably. What makes this transition difficult to see is that it does not replace the original narrative. It exists alongside it. Exploration still happens, science is still conducted. But beneath those objectives, another layer begins to take shape, one that is not defined by discovery, but by use. And once that layer is recognized, the return to the moon stops feeling like a revisit. It starts to feel like the beginning of something that was never intended to be temporary. Once the goal shifts from reaching the moon to staying on it, the nature of every mission changes. The systems being developed are no longer designed for brief exposure. They are built to endure isolation, extreme conditions, and long-term operation without constant support from Earth. This is where the deeper layer begins to emerge. Energy systems must function through long periods of darkness. Habitats must protect against radiation and temperature extremes. Communication must remain stable across vast distances. Each challenge forces a solution that is not temporary but sustainable. And as these solutions take shape, they begin to resemble something more than preparation. They resemble adaptation. What is being tested is not just technology. It is the ability to operate beyond Earth as a continuous presence, a gradual shift from dependency to autonomy. And while none of these elements appear significant on their own, together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Because if the objective were only to visit, none of this would be necessary. But if the objective is to remain, then every detail begins to make sense. And that raises a quieter question. If staying becomes possible, then the moon is no longer just a destination. It becomes a starting point. When the moon shifts from destination to starting point, its meaning changes far beyond space itself. What happens there does not stay there. It begins to influence decisions, priorities, and balances here on Earth in ways that are not immediately visible, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Access to resources beyond Earth introduces a new kind of advantage, not just scientific but economic. The ability to produce fuel, support missions, and reduce the cost of operating in space creates leverage that extends well beyond exploration. It shapes who can move further, faster, and with greater independence. And once that capability exists, it begins to redefine what power looks like on a global scale. At the same time, positioning becomes critical. Being present is not the same as having access. Location, timing, and continuity start to matter in ways that mirror patterns already seen on Earth. Trade routes, strategic zones, controlled access points. The same logic begins to emerge, only now applied beyond the planet. This is where the return to the moon connects back to something larger, not as a distant ambition, but as part of a shift that is already underway. One that links technology, resources, and influence into a system that is still forming, but already shaping the direction of what comes next. By now, the pattern is no longer made of isolated details. It begins to align into something more coherent. The timing of the missions, the focus on specific regions, the simultaneous movement of multiple actors, and the technologies being prioritized all start pointing in the same direction. Not as a single explanation, but as a convergence. The moon is not being approached randomly. It is being approached methodically. Step by step, capability by capability, presence is being established in a way that does not depend on a single mission succeeding, but on the system as a whole continuing to evolve. And when you view it from that perspective, the urgency begins to feel less like ambition and more like alignment with something that cannot be delayed. Each piece reinforces the others. Access enables activity. Activity justifies infrastructure. Infrastructure supports permanence, and permanence changes the role of the moon entirely. What once seemed distant and static begins to take on a function that is active and influential. At this point, the original narrative has not disappeared, but it no longer explains everything. It explains enough to remain visible while the deeper structure forms underneath, gradually connecting elements that, on their own, never seemed related. And once those connections are seen together, the return to the moon stops being a question of intent and starts to look like a transition already in progress. At this point, the return to the moon no longer feels like a decision that still needs to be explained. It feels like a direction that has already been chosen, long before it became visible. What we are seeing now is not the beginning of that movement, but the moment it starts to take form in a way that can no longer be ignored. The pieces that once seemed separate now carry a different meaning when seen together. Exploration, technology, cooperation, competition, none of them disappear. They simply take on a new role within a larger structure that is still unfolding. A structure built not around reaching the moon, but around what becomes possible once presence there is sustained. And that is where the shift becomes complete. The question was never only about going back. It was about what changes when leaving is no longer required. Because the moment presence becomes continuous, the moon stops being a destination that we visit and becomes part of a system that extends beyond Earth itself. Maybe the real reason we are going back was never hidden. It was always there, just seen through a different lens. And now that the perspective has changed, the return no longer looks like a repeat of the past. It looks like the beginning of something that was always meant to continue. If you want, I can now turn this into a full narration script with pacing, pauses, and cinematic timing, or generate image prompts aligned with each chapter.